Hey guys, tonight we're going to wander slowly and a little suspiciously into the candle-lit back rooms and straw-strewn corridors of the medieval mind. You'll find that behind the stained glass saints and creaky wooden pews lurked a set of bedroom customs so bewildering that you'll question whether your pillow is truly safe. Forget noble knights and virtuous maidens. What you're about to hear is the quieter, stranger story of what people really did when the curtains closed. And no, you probably won't survive this without at least one bewildered eyebrow raise. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's easy to imagine the medieval world as a place of rigid piety and moral restraint. The official story told from pulpit and parchment alike insisted that sex was a solemn act, confined to marriage and performed only for the purpose of producing children. Yet the truth, as with so many things in history, is far knottier, more contradictory, and in some cases, hilariously strange. In the shadowy margins of life, humans were still humans, curious, inventive, and often willing to ignore the sermon for the sake of their own peculiar pleasures. Picture a bustling market town in the 14th century, carts rattling over cobblestones, the smell of freshly baked bread wafting past the tannery's far less appealing aroma. On the surface, people appear occupied with the essentials of survival, trading, mending, praying for good harvests. But if you stepped behind the half-latched door of an alehouse, or down the narrow alley between two timber-framed homes, you might stumble into one of the era's many off-the-books social experiments. Some of these were harmless flirtations. Others were elaborate traditions designed to skirt the strictures of church law. One such practice, surprisingly common in rural communities, was known as bundling. On winter nights, when the cold could turn breath into frosty clouds, young unmarried couples would be allowed, encouraged even to share a bed fully clothed, sometimes with a heavy wooden board between them. In theory, this was a wholesome way to court while staying warm. In reality, well, let's just say that medieval villagers placed a great deal of faith in woolen layers and self-control. Some parents even joined in the ritual, sleeping nearby as unofficial chaperones, snoring blissfully as their offspring whispered into the darkness. Then there were the festivals. If you think modern bachelor or hen parties are wild, imagine the medieval equivalent village celebrations that sometimes blurred the line between sacred and profane. During certain feast days, masks and costumes transformed neighbors into unrecognizable figures, and the loosening of social rules opened the door to behavior that would have been scandalous the next morning. The anonymity of a mask offered not just mischief, but license. In those fleeting hours, one might flirt outrageously, swap clothing with the opposite sex, or engage in games with unmistakably suggestive undertones. Of course, the church disapproved. Edicts were issued, sermons thundered, and the more zealous parish priests took it upon themselves to patrol these events, peering disapprovingly from the edges. But enforcement was inconsistent, and in many cases the clergy themselves were whispered to indulge in the very behaviors they condemned. The medieval appetite for the strange was not easily extinguished. As the candles gutter in your imagined medieval chamber, you can almost hear the muffled laughter of those who thought they had found clever loopholes to divine law. Yet these were not merely acts of rebellion. They were part of a much larger negotiation between human desire and religious authority. This tug-of-war shaped not just private lives, but the very texture of medieval society. And as you settle deeper into your pillow, we will drift into stranger waters still, where belief, superstition, and sheer eccentricity combine to create some of the most bizarre sexual customs ever recorded. Take, for instance, the springtime plow blessing rites. In some regions, newly married couples were paraded around the edges of tilled fields, sometimes with overt symbolic gestures meant to encourage the land to imitate their union. These processions might involve the couple walking barefoot, carrying seed baskets, or in certain accounts being lightly sprinkled with grain and ale by village elders who muttered blessings under their breath. The symbolism was not exactly subtle, but the earnestness with which it was carried out made it a fixture of rural life. Another belief, one that would have the modern mind tilting its head in confusion, was the notion that physical proximity to the act of conception could confer luck or fertility upon bystanders. It's difficult to confirm how literally this was taken, but some chroniclers hint at practices in which newlyweds were deliberately housed in central locations during their wedding nights, so that neighbors might be inspired by the sounds or rhythms drifting from their chambers. A medieval understanding of acoustics was apparently not part of the plan. This intertwining of sex and magic went deeper still. Amulets and charms crafted from animal bones, carved wood, or even braided hair were exchanged between lovers, not only as tokens of affection, but as talismans to enhance virility or fidelity. Recipes for such charms appeared in handwritten herbals, alongside instructions for poultices and ointments, which must have made for fascinating reading by candlelight. Some of these formulas prescribed herbs we recognize today for their mild aphrodisiac effects like ginseng or fennel, but others strayed into decidedly questionable territory involving powders made from dried insects or the ashes of birds. The logic behind such ingredients was often symbolic. If a creature was prolific or passionate in life, its remains might transfer that quality to the bearer. Of course, not all bizarre practices were born from hope alone. Some were rooted in fear of infertility, fear of disease, fear of divine punishment. In a society where plagues and famines could strike without warning, and medical science was still tangled in Galenic theories of humors, sexuality was often policed with an anxious hand. Manuals for confessors intended to guide priests in hearing the sins of their flock went into painstaking detail about which acts were considered mortal offenses. Some of these prohibitions sound almost comical now, forbidding positions deemed unnatural or outlawing intimacy on certain holy days under threat of eternal damnation. Yet the very existence of such lists hints that the rules were being bent, if not outright broken, often enough to require constant repetition. The confessional booth became in its own way a record keeper of human curiosity and stubbornness. There whispered behind wooden screens, people laid bare their transgressions in hopes of absolution, and perhaps also in search of a sympathetic ear. One can almost imagine a weary parish priest, eyes half closed, listening to yet another farmer confess the same indiscretion committed the same day each year during a certain festival. The boundaries between licit and illicit were further blurred by the involvement of so-called wise women and folk healers. These figures, often older women with deep knowledge of herbs and charms, might be called upon to brew love potions or concoct remedies for waning desire. Some of their methods were relatively harmless infusions of honey, cinnamon, and wine, for example, which might warm the body and spirit alike. Others were more suspect, involving ingredients whose only guaranteed effect was mild poisoning. Still, the belief in their efficacy was strong enough to keep these clandestine services in quiet demand, even as the Church officially condemned them as witchcraft. Perhaps the most startling aspect of medieval intimacy was how public it could be. not in the sense of indiscriminate display, but in how communal life left little room for privacy. In peasant households, entire families might share a single sleeping space. Curtains, if they existed at all, were a luxury. The sounds and movements of the night were as much a part of the household's soundtrack as the crackle of the hearth. For young couples, this meant that intimacy unfolded within earshot and often in the presence of others. Such closeness could hardly fail to shape attitudes toward sex, normalizing what in later centuries would be deemed scandalously open. As you lie there in your own quiet, modern room, imagine drifting back to a night when the cold seeped through every crack in the walls and bodies huddled together, not just for warmth, but for reassurance that life, despite its hardships, was still pulsing in the dark. These moments, both ordinary and strange, formed the hidden tapestry of medieval life. And as we follow its threads further, you'll see how the human urge for connection found even stranger, more elaborate outlets. One particularly curious set of customs revolved around what could be called the ritual teasing of lovers. In some towns, there existed a tradition of locking up young men or women during the courting process, sometimes literally. This could mean being shut in a small chamber ostensibly for contemplation or prayer before a marriage was finalized. In practice, such enforced seclusion might serve less as a holy retreat and more as an extended opportunity for the imagination to wander. There are hints in some chronicles that the locked chamber was not always as well guarded as the official story claimed, and that determined suitors sometimes found creative ways to bypass these moral safeguards. In other places, the teasing took on an even stranger form. Records from certain parts of Central Europe describe night visits in which a young man approved by the girl's family would slip into her bed under the watch of parents or siblings. In theory, this was purely a courtship rite. The couple might talk hold hands and perhaps steal a kiss under the blankets while the household pretended to sleep. In reality, Human nature has a way of turning theory into practice. Equally strange were some of the medical ideas that filtered into intimate life. For example, it was widely believed that an imbalance of bodily humors could be corrected by specific sexual activities timed carefully with the phases of the moon. Physicians drawing on ancient Greek and Roman sources sometimes prescribed intercourse as a treatment for ailments ranging from melancholy to digestive troubles. The advice was often couched in veiled language, especially when written for polite or ecclesiastical audiences, but in private, the instructions could be surprisingly explicit. One can picture a slightly bewildered medieval patient dutifully following a healer's lunar calendar in hopes of clearing up a persistent cough. Then there was the matter of courtly love that elevated, almost theatrical form of desire cultivated among the nobility. Poets and troubadours sang of unattainable ladies' nights, pledged their service in elaborate ceremonies, and love letters were penned with the intensity of a religious vow. Yet beneath the lofty metaphors and chivalric codes, there often simmered a far more earthly attraction. In some courts, the rituals of courtly love were little more than a socially acceptable cover for affairs, with carefully choreographed flirtations serving as the opening act for more private meetings. The poetry may have been beautiful, but it was also at times a fig leaf for scandal. Among the strangest expressions of this blend of high art and physical longing was the exchange of so-called tokens of favor. A knight might wear his lady's scarf into battle, or carry a locket with a strand of her hair. In some cases, the token was more intimate. Whispered accounts speak of noblewomen gifting favored suitors with personal garments, or even small perfumed pouches meant to be worn close to the skin as a reminder of the giver's presence. Whether these gestures were purely symbolic or carried more suggestive undertones, they reveal how the personal and the public could intertwine in ways that make modern sensibilities blink. Of course, not all customs were so romantic. Some were startlingly transactional. In certain parts of Europe, marriage negotiations could involve discussions not just of dowries and property, but of physical compatibility tested in some cases through bizarre public competitions or displays. One particularly eyebrow-raising example involved a would-be bridegroom demonstrating his physical prowess, sometimes in events with more than a hint of innuendo. Whether the goal was to reassure the bride's family or simply to entertain the gathered villagers, these performances turned courtship into something perilously close to a spectator sport. Meanwhile, for those outside the bonds of respectable marriage, widows, traveling merchants, seasonal laborers, the rules shifted yet again. Some towns maintained tolerated districts for sexual commerce, not entirely unlike later red light areas. Within these spaces, brothels operated under a patchwork of regulations, often required to close during certain holy seasons or forbidden to employ women from the local parish. The clientele ranged from visiting pilgrims to the local garrison, and the atmosphere could oscillate between bawdy revelry and whispered discretion. In such places, unusual requests and peculiar personal arrangements were less the exception than the norm, providing a kind of living archive of human eccentricity. And so the medieval world teemed with practices that blurred the lines between propriety, superstition, and play. What to us might seem strange, even absurd, was for them part of a continuous, complex negotiation between desire and decorum. As you drift further into the quiet, imagine how such customs, half hidden, half celebrated, wove themselves into the daily rhythms of life. For the next turn in our journey, we'll follow those threads into even darker, more secretive chambers, where belief and taboo shaped behaviors that were stranger still. In many regions, there were elaborate superstitions about when intimacy could and could not occur. These were not merely about holy days. Entire weeks or even months could be deemed unsuitable depending on the liturgical calendar, the planting season, or local taboos. Lent, for instance, was a famously austere time, and many were warned that marital relations during this period could result in sickly or cursed children. Some particularly zealous moralists extended this ban to Fridays year-round, citing the day's association with the crucifixion. The cumulative effect could mean that nearly half the calendar was marked off-limits, which must have required either a great deal of self-restraint or a flexible interpretation of the rules. Where prohibitions multiplied, so too did workarounds. Couples seeking a loophole might cloak their meetings in the guise of other domestic duties. A trip to fetch water, a visit to the bakehouse, or an errand to deliver fresh linens could provide just enough unsupervised time for a stolen moment together. In some cases, entire households seemed to conspire in these deceptions, turning a blind eye to suspiciously long walks to the well or errands in the fields. The line between complicity and tradition blurred until it was almost invisible. Certain towns even developed coded languages for such arrangements. Market gossip could conceal as much as it revealed. A comment about borrowing the neighbor's plow might carry a meaning entirely unrelated to farming. In a society where public speech was carefully monitored, these euphemisms allowed for frank conversation without the risk of direct accusation. Such linguistic games could be both playful and protective, binding communities together through shared winks and nods. There was also a fascination, half fearful, half curious, about physical differences and anomalies. In an age before medical privacy, stories of unusual anatomy could travel quickly embroidered with every retelling. These tales sometimes took on the weight of myth, assigning supernatural origins to traits that modern science would explain in seconds. A particularly striking feature might be seen as the mark of a witch, a sign of divine favor, or proof of descent from some legendary figure. And in a world hungry for marvels, such stories could affect a person's fortunes, determining who might be desired, avoided, or even sought out in secret. Among the more esoteric practices were those aimed at influencing the outcome of conception. Folklore brimmed with instructions for ensuring a child of a particular sex, ranging from dietary rules to oddly choreographed bedroom arrangements. Some advise that the hopeful parents align themselves with certain constellations, or that they avoid particular foods before attempting to conceive. Others went further still, recommending ritual washing with herbal infusions, or even sleeping with symbolic objects beneath the bed. These rituals might sound quaint or absurd now, but they were often carried out with deep sincerity and perhaps a faint smile at the more theatrical details. Meanwhile, in urban centers, there emerged what might be called the professionalization of certain intimate services. Beyond the brothels tolerated by civic authorities, there were individuals who offered specialized skills, often at the edge of legality. Matchmakers, for example, could be hired to arrange discreet liaisons navigating the delicate politics of family honor. There were also those who claimed to restore virginity through dubious surgical or herbal means, a trade that thrived in environments where a woman's marital prospects could hinge on this single, heavily scrutinized detail. The demand for such services tells its own quiet story about the pressures and expectations of the time. Not all of these shadow world customs were purely transactional or born of necessity. Some were simply playful games between lovers that developed their own traditions over time. The exchange of riddles, the carving of initials into hidden spots, the secret passing of notes folded into complex patterns. All of these could serve as preludes to more tangible encounters. In noble courts, such gestures might be wrapped in layers of symbolism, while in village lanes, they might be as straightforward as a wink across the market. What is perhaps most striking is how these private acts coexisted with the constant public surveillance of small community life. Everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. Yet this same closeness allowed for a sort of collective discretion, an unspoken agreement that certain things were better left unmentioned. The paradox of medieval intimacy was that it was both intensely visible and carefully hidden, a dance performed in plain sight, yet cloaked in ritual superstition and mutually understood silence. As the imaginary fire in our story's hearth burns lower, you can almost hear the shuffle of feet in a quiet corridor, the soft click of a latch, and the faint murmur of voices in the dark. The medieval night had its own language, its own rhythms, and its own strange blend of caution and daring. In the next turn of our journey, we'll find ourselves brushing against the even more elaborate rituals of love and desire, rituals so entangled with belief and social standing that they could shape not only lives, but reputations for generations. In noble households, this vigilance reached an almost theatrical pitch. A lady of rank might never be left alone with a suitor without the presence of a chaperone, often a trusted female relative, or a senior servant who was as much a watchful guardian as a companion. Yet these chaperones were sometimes complicit in bending the rules. A well-timed cough, a conveniently long trip to fetch wine, or an overly enthusiastic interest in the far side of the garden could create fleeting windows of privacy. Such moments might be all that was needed for the exchange of a kiss, a whispered promise, or the passing of a secret token. These tokens could be as innocent as a ribbon, or as provocative as an object with a clear, if discreet, implication. Some lovers communicated through the language of flowers, a code that could be read by the informed eye, a sprig of rosemary for remembrance, a red carnation for deep affection, and more daring still plants with subtle folkloric ties to passion or fertility. In this way, a bouquet left on a window ledge could be as eloquent as a written confession. In rural communities where such refinements were less common, signs of courtship could be even more straightforward. A young man might leave a carved trinket on a woman's doorstep, or deliberately linger at her family's market stall long after his errands were complete. In some traditions, a suitor would attempt small acts of service, mending a fence, helping with the harvest, or bringing choice cuts of meat to the household. These gestures, while outwardly practical, were often understood for what they were, the quiet staking of a claim. But for all the formalities, medieval love could also be intensely practical. Marriages were alliances, economic, political, and social contracts, often arranged with an eye toward mutual advantage. Love, if it bloomed, was a welcome bonus, but not the main priority. This practical view could produce situations in which a marriage was contracted between people who had barely exchanged a handful of words, yet were now expected to share a life and a bed. Under such circumstances, the customs surrounding the wedding night became a matter of public concern, even spectacle. In some places, it was customary for members of the community to accompany the newlyweds to their chamber in a noisy, rowdy procession. Torches flared, music played, and the couple might be teased mercilessly about the duties awaiting them. In more intrusive traditions, certain witnesses, relatives, or even officials remained nearby to ensure that the union was consummated. While this might strike modern sensibilities as unbearably invasive in the medieval mindset, it was a safeguard proof that the marriage was valid and any future heirs would be legitimate. Yet even here, human ingenuity found its ways of subverting the script. Some couples staged the appearance of consummation for the benefit of onlookers, retreating to genuine privacy only after the watchers had been satisfied or bored enough to leave. In other cases, elaborate pranks were played on the couple, hiding their clothes, swapping their bedding for something absurd, or filling the chamber with inconvenient objects that had to be cleared away before anything else could happen. These rituals, half blessing and half mockery, underscored how marriage was not simply a personal commitment, but a communal event woven into the life of the village or court. Beyond the wedding, there was the delicate matter of managing attraction outside of marriage. Despite the stern moral codes, extramarital liaisons were hardly unknown, particularly among the upper classes, where political marriages could leave personal desires unfulfilled. Affairs might be conducted under the cover of elaborate courtly love rituals or disguised as devotional friendships. The risks where real discovery could lead to scandal, exile, or worse. Yet the rewards, passion, companionship, or the thrill of defying convention were tempting enough to inspire elaborate schemes. One such scheme, recorded in a 15th century French chronicle, involved a lady of the court who arranged for her lover to disguise himself as a traveling minstrel. Under this guise, he could wander the halls, sing in the great chamber, and deliver his messages in the form of verses no one but she fully understood. Such ingenuity was not unique. Across Europe, lovers employed codes, disguises, and intermediaries to maintain their connections beneath the watchful eyes of household and community. And then, of course, there were the tales, half fact, half legend, of love potions and enchanted objects used to sway hearts. Some were simple infusions of wine and herbs, their effects more psychological than chemical. Others strayed into the realm of dangerous alchemy involving powders and tinctures that could sicken or kill if mishandled. Whether these concoctions worked in the way their makers claimed is doubtful, but the belief in them was strong enough to drive secret midnight meetings, whispered transactions, and the occasional dramatic accusation of witchcraft. All of these threads, ritual secrecy, performance, and practicality, wove together into a tapestry of medieval intimacy that was as intricate as it was strange. And as we drift deeper into that tapestry, we will soon find ourselves in the company of the truly peculiar practices so odd and sometimes so elaborate that they could exist only in a world where faith, fear, and desire were constantly entangled. Consider the ritual known in certain alpine communities as charm sleeping. A would-be lover might sleep with an object belonging to the desired person, a glove, a scrap of fabric, even a lock of hair tucked beneath their pillow, believing that doing so for a prescribed number of nights would draw the person's affection. In some versions, the dreamer would recite short rhymes or invocations before sleep, calling on saints or spirits for aid. While such practices might sound quaint, they could carry deep emotional weight. Failure to follow the ritual exactly, it was said, could turn the charm against the user, bringing not love but estrangement. Some customs were more public and ceremonial. In parts of northern France, a spring festival included a peculiar matchmaking game in which unmarried young people drew names from a basket to determine partners for the season. These partnerships were meant to encourage courtship, but they also gave license for behavior that might otherwise draw censure. Partners exchanged small gifts, danced together, and sometimes engaged in playful mock weddings. If true affection blossomed, the match could lead to an actual marriage. If not, the partnership dissolved at the next festival with little harm done. Yet behind the laughter, the event reinforced the community's watchful role in shaping who paired with whom. In the more superstitious corners of Europe, love and desire were sometimes tested through ordeals. One particularly odd trial involved the baking of love bread. A woman might knead dough while reciting the name of her intended, then bake it in a communal oven. If the bread rose well and kept its shape, the match was deemed blessed. If it collapsed or burned, the union was ill-starred. In certain accounts, the bread was shared not with the beloved, but with the entire household, ensuring that the omen was widely known, whether flattering or not. The line between intimate belief and outright magical thinking could be remarkably thin. Astrological guides were consulted for auspicious days, not only for planting crops or starting journeys, but for beginning a marriage or attempting conception. Some manuals gave intricate instructions: avoid Venus in retrograde, favor the waxing moon, beware eclipses. A particularly zealous astrologer might chart both partners' birth signs to determine compatibility, with charts sometimes preserved as part of the couple's marital record. And while much of this may sound like harmless folk tradition, there were also harsher practices rooted in fear of betrayal or infidelity. Jealousy was a powerful force in the medieval world, and some went to extraordinary lengths to guard against it. In a few regions, husbands required their wives to wear symbolic belts or locked girdles, more a display of control than a functional barrier, but potent in its message. In some cases, these devices were less about preventing unfaithfulness than about publicly asserting the husband's claim, a visible reminder to any would-be rival. Among the wealthy, such symbols could be elaborately decorated with enamel embroidery or gemstones, transforming an object of suspicion into a statement of status. Among the poor, simpler versions were made of leather or cloth, no less meaningful for their plainness. Whether or not they were effective is questionable. What mattered was the belief they represented. Fear of the unknown also colored attitudes toward physical difference, as we touched on earlier. In certain communities, unusual birthmarks or physical traits were believed to confer special powers in matters of attraction. A mole in a particular spot might be taken as a sign of heightened desire. A crooked finger could be read as a token of seductiveness. These interpretations could shape a person's reputation for years, influencing who might seek them out or shun them entirely. At the stranger end of the spectrum were ceremonies meant to cure or reverse unwanted desire. These might involve bathing in rivers at dawn, wearing amulets fashioned from particular stones, or reciting prayers backwards. Some remedies were strikingly theatrical. A person might be instructed to walk around the boundary of the village 3 times, carrying an egg in one hand and a sprig of rosemary in the other, without speaking to anyone. By the final circuit, it was believed the troubling affection would fade. Such measures reveal how deeply intertwined emotion, belief, and community life were in the medieval imagination. Love and attraction were not solely private experiences. They were forces that could influence fortunes, reputations, and even the perceived well-being of the wider community. And in the midst of these strange customs, some people found ways to bend the rules, turning superstition to their advantage, wrapping desire in ritual, and hiding passion behind a veil of tradition. As the glow of our imagined hearth dwindles, think of the flicker of lamplight on embroidered cloth, the murmur of verses spoken into a darkened room, and the curious certainty that a charm, a star, or a piece of bread might determine the fate of a heart. And as we drift onward, we'll find that the medieval appetite for the peculiar could run to extremes, especially when secrecy, politics, and the human body all became tangled in the same knot. Among the nobility, arranged marriages were often sealed by public ritual, followed by a very private, yet symbolically important act, the bedding ceremony. This was not always as straightforward as it sounds. In certain courts, the newlyweds were escorted to bed in front of select witnesses who offered blessings, ribald jokes, and occasionally far too much practical advice. In some cases, garments were ceremonially removed by attendants or symbolic objects. Rings, coins, sprigs of evergreen were placed on the bed as tokens of fertility and prosperity. What happened next was meant to remain private, but gossip could turn even the smallest detail into a story repeated across the entire court. In a few notorious households, political rivals used these occasions to plant damaging rumors. A whisper that the bride had looked reluctant, that the groom had seemed unsure, or that the bedding had been delayed, could feed into larger intrigues. In a world where heirs were the lifeblood of dynasties, even a hint of trouble in the marriage bed could have consequences stretching far beyond the couple themselves. Outside the courts in towns and villages, bedding rituals could be less formal, but no less public. Friends and neighbors might accompany the couple with songs, drums, or pots and pans, creating a joyful racket meant to drive away evil spirits, or perhaps simply to embarrass the newlyweds into swift retreat. In some traditions, this charivari could be revived later in the marriage if the community disapproved of a couple's behavior, turning merriment into pointed social commentary. Where politics and intimacy met most directly, however, was in the practice of trial marriages or handfastings. In some regions, especially in the British Isles, couples could enter into a binding agreement for a set period, often a year and a day, after which they could choose to formalize the marriage or part ways. While these arrangements were sometimes purely practical, giving the pair time to assess compatibility, they could also be used to cement political or economic deals without committing fully. The ambiguity of such unions gave rise to endless debates in local courts, and more than one scandal when a partner claimed the relationship was binding while the other insisted it was not. In more superstitious circles, the physical act of union itself could be ritualized to an almost ceremonial degree. Certain handbooks for midwives and folk healers included instructions for ensuring that first unions were fruitful, down to which direction the couple should face and what they should eat beforehand. Some recommended that specific saints be invoked at key moments. Others prescribed the placement of blessed herbs beneath the bed or in the pillow stuffing. The belief was that neglecting these details could doom a marriage to barrenness or worse, invite misfortune upon the household. And then there were the darker uses of such rituals. A skilled manipulator could employ them to justify breaking a marriage or casting doubt on its legitimacy. Claiming that the union had been performed on an inauspicious day without the proper blessings or in a room lacking certain talismans could form the basis for an annulment. In some courts, such technicalities were eagerly seized upon by those with the right connections, while less powerful couples found themselves stuck with whatever fate had given them. Even in humbler settings, accusations of ritual failure could sting. Imagine a farming village where the barley harvest had been poor 2 years in a row. Whispers might begin that the problem lay not with the weather, but with a particular marriage that had been unblessed or ill-starred. In such a tight-knit community, the couple could find themselves subtly or not so subtly pressured to undergo a second ceremony, complete with blessings, feasts, and symbolic gestures meant to set things right. Beyond the human intrigues, there was also the ever-present shadow of divine and supernatural judgment. Dreams were closely watched for signs. A vision of certain animals, flowers, or even colors could be interpreted as commentary on a relationship's health. Some people sought out professional dream readers, often elderly women known for their skill in weaving omens from nocturnal visions. These interpretations could affect everything from when a couple chose to conceive to whether they decided to remain together at all. What's striking is how often these customs blurred the line between sincere belief and social strategy. A charm might be worn out of genuine faith in its power, or as a visible sign to the community that one was following tradition. A blessing might be sought not only for its supposed spiritual benefit, but to display loyalty to a patron saint favored by a powerful neighbor. In this way, intimacy was never entirely private. It was stitched into the web of obligations, alliances, and watchful eyes that defined medieval life. And as you settle deeper into the quiet rhythm of this tale, you can almost feel the weight of those invisible threads, the whispered bargains, the unspoken expectations, and the delicate dance between desire and duty. For in the next steps of our journey, the medieval fascination with the strange will lead us even further from the firelit hall into places where love and ritual take on forms that are by turns tender, absurd, and unmistakably bizarre. One such practice was the blessing of the marriage bed itself. In some regions, this was no quiet sprinkling of holy water, but a full ritual. A priest accompanied by witnesses would walk the perimeter of the bed, sometimes chanting psalms, sometimes reciting blessings in Latin that very few of those present could actually understand. At times, small relics or charms were sewn into the bed hangings or hidden beneath the mattress. These might include sprigs of rosemary or juniper for protection, scraps of cloth embroidered with sacred symbols, or even coins from a prosperous household to encourage fertility. In certain households, the bed was not merely a piece of furniture, but a sacred space, its sanctity renewed at important moments, such as the birth of a child or the return of a husband from war. In rural areas where priests were less available, families improvised. Village elders or wise women might take on the role, muttering blessings over the bed, placing herbal bundles in its corners, or tapping the headboard with a carved stick said to banish malevolent spirits. The ritual could become a social event in itself. Neighbors might gather to watch, offer their own charms, and contribute gifts for the couple's new household. These gatherings blurred the line between blessing and celebration, and in more raucous villages, they could end with bawdy songs and an excess of ale. And yet, medieval people also worried that too much happiness or passion could attract the evil eye. Protective gestures against jealousy, both mortal and supernatural, were woven into love life almost as tightly as the romance itself. Some couples hung amulets carved with strange looping symbols above their bed. Others burned certain herbs before sleep, the smoke curling toward the rafters in lazy, fragrant ribbons. In a few regions, an iron object, a nail, a horseshoe, even a knife was placed discreetly under the bed as a ward. These measures, while defensive in intent, were also deeply symbolic, a way of acknowledging that passion, like prosperity, was a tempting target for ill will. Oddly enough, some of the most intimate customs were also the most public. Seasonal fairs and market days offered occasions for love lotteries, in which young men and women drew names to determine partners for a day or for the duration of the festival. While ostensibly just a bit of fun, these pairings could open doors to courtship, flirtation, and sometimes much more. The anonymity of the draw lent a kind of legitimacy to sudden connections. After all, it was fate's choice, not one's own. And if the pairing did not suit well, the next year's lottery might bring a better outcome. At the other end of the spectrum were the public confessions of love or attraction, often staged as part of local festivities. A suitor might stand in the village square to declare admiration for a particular person, sometimes offering a gift, sometimes reciting a poem. While these displays could be sincere, they were also a form of performance, allowing a bold personality to shine, or in some cases to provoke playful embarrassment in the chosen recipient. The onlookers' reactions formed part of the spectacle, reinforcing the idea that love was as much a social affair as a private one. In noble courts, the public-private divide could become even stranger. There are records of mock trials of love where courtiers acted as judges, advocates, and witnesses in elaborate cases brought before a fictional court of Cupid. The accused might be charged with cruelty for rejecting a suitor or theft for stealing another's heart. Witnesses, often the friends or rivals of the parties, would give florid, exaggerated testimony. The proceedings, while ostensibly light-hearted, could carry pointed commentary on real relationships, allowing gossip and grievance to be aired in a playful disguise. Amid these entertainments and rites ran a constant undercurrent of superstition. The phases of the moon, the direction of the wind, even the day of the week, could be consulted before arranging a tryst or attempting conception. Monday associated with the moon and changeability was sometimes avoided. Friday, sacred to Venus, but also to Christian penitents, had a mixed reputation. A particularly propitious time might draw couples into hurried meetings, while an ill-omened one could lead them to delay. And perhaps most peculiar of all was how ordinary all this seemed to those who lived it. What we might see as elaborate ritual was for them simply part of life's rhythm. Just as one salted meat before winter, or planted by the right phase of the moon, one courted, loved, and married within the framework of tradition and belief. Even the strangest practices were anchored in the conviction that to neglect them was to tempt fate, and in a world where fate could be cruel, that was a risk few were willing to take. As the fire in our imagined chamber fades to embers, think of those amulets swinging gently above a curtained bed, the faint scent of rosemary lingering in the air, and the laughter of neighbors spilling in from the street. For the next stretch of our journey, we'll slip into the more secretive corners still, where love and desire become tangled with punishment penance and the peculiar moral gymnastics of the medieval mind. Some of the more curious penances involved public acts meant to symbolize repentance. In certain towns, an adulterer might be required to walk barefoot through the streets, carrying a candle as long as his arm presenting it at the altar of the local church. Others were ordered to process around the village green, wearing a shift or undershirt, sometimes with a placard declaring the nature of their sin. The intention was as much about public shame as spiritual correction, a reminder to the community that misbehavior did not go unnoticed. Yet in some cases, these spectacles took on a theatrical, almost carnivalesque air. Onlookers might jeer or hurl playful insults. Children might follow in noisy groups. The condemned could be offered mock advice on how to behave better next time. For all the church's seriousness, the people themselves sometimes turned penance into entertainment. A strange marriage of morality play and village fare. In monasteries and convents, discipline could take more inward-facing forms. A monk or nun suspected of violating chastity might be required to perform extra fasts, recite lengthy prayers at night, or abstain from speaking for a set period. In more severe cases, the offender could be confined to a cell for days or weeks, expected to meditate on their failing. But even here, the boundaries blurred. The stories that emerged from these cloistered walls, often whispered long after the fact, suggest that not all punishments were entirely free of the same human impulses they were meant to suppress. One particularly odd practice found in some penitential manuals involved symbolic reversals. A married couple guilty of misconduct might be ordered to sleep apart for a prescribed number of nights, except in reverse positions, with the wife on the husband's usual side of the bed, and vice versa. The reversal was thought to disrupt habitual patterns, forcing the couple to reflect on their relationship. While the spiritual logic behind it may be debatable, it did at least avoid the more invasive public shaming of other penances. Sometimes punishment and superstition merged into strange hybrid customs. In certain alpine villages, a man accused of being overly lustful could be cured by being made to carry a sheaf of nettles against his bare skin while walking the church's perimeter. In theory, the pain and humiliation drove out sinful thoughts. In practice, it seems just as likely to have produced a strong desire never to be caught again. There was also the curious matter of enforced pilgrimages. Pilgrimage was both a spiritual duty and a recognized form of penance, and some were sent on long journeys specifically as punishment for sexual misdeeds. A wayward spouse might be ordered to travel to a distant shrine, sometimes hundreds of miles away, before being allowed to return home. The journey itself was thought to cleanse the soul, while the separation served as a cooling-off period for the relationship. Of course, whether the absence truly discouraged temptation is another question entirely. In the more theatrical courts of Southern Europe, punishment could be woven into pageantry. A scandal involving a noble couple might be resolved through a staged reconciliation before a gathered audience, complete with speeches, symbolic gestures, and sometimes a reenactment of the wedding vows. This public display of restored harmony reassured allies, pacified gossip, and reinforced the notion that even love and lust must bow to the order of the community. Perhaps strangest of all were the cases where penance itself became a kind of sanctioned intimacy. In certain confessional contexts, priests dispensed detailed remedies that involved not just abstinence but specific acts between spouses framed as spiritually corrective. These instructions could be surprisingly prescriptive, outlining when, how, and under what conditions marital relations should resume. The church's hand thus reached right into the marital bed, turning private life into an arena of moral discipline. Yet for all the moralizing people found ways to navigate and even exploit the system. Some performed penance with exaggerated zeal, earning a reputation for piety that could later shield them from suspicion. Others treated minor punishments almost as badges of honor, turning their notoriety into a kind of social capital. In this way, even the system meant to control desire could be bent to serve it. And so the medieval landscape was full of paradoxes: desire condemned, yet indulged; punished, yet woven into the rituals of daily life. The more we look, the more we see that these customs were not isolated oddities, but part of a continuous negotiation between human impulse and social order. And as we move forward, we'll begin to see how these negotiations produced traditions so elaborate, so steeped in symbolism and performance, that they could seem like entire plays staged upon the fragile stage of the human heart. One of the strangest examples of this was the mock wedding, staged not as a joke in the modern sense, but as a sanctioned piece of public commentary. In villages across parts of France, Germany, and the Low Countries, couples whose relationship fell outside approved norms, perhaps a widower marrying again too soon, or an older bride taking a much younger husband, might be honored with a parody version of a wedding. Locals dressed in outlandish costumes mimicked the couple's mannerisms and acted out a farcical ceremony in the marketplace or outside their home. On the surface, it was festive. Underneath it was a pointed reminder that the community was watching. In other cases, the stage was set inside the church itself. There were ecclesiastical courts dedicated to hearing cases of love marriage and fidelity, and their proceedings could be as much performance as jurisprudence. Witnesses delivered long, elaborate statements. Scribes recorded each flourish of testimony, and verdicts were often accompanied by moralizing speeches. For the audience, because there often was one, these trials were a kind of moral drama, reinforcing ideals of proper conduct, while offering a delicious peek into other people's affairs. Meanwhile, in noble courts, the theatricality took a more refined form. Masks and pageants might tell stories of mythical lovers, star-crossed couples, or romantic trials, thinly veiling commentary on real members of the court. A lavish costume, a sly glance, a line in a song that seemed just a little too pointed. These could all serve as coded messages in the ongoing conversation between appearance and reality. Courtiers adept at reading such signs could decode layers of meaning invisible to outsiders. Even the rituals of betrothal could feel like performances. In some regions, a formal handclasp before witnesses marked the engagement, often accompanied by the exchange of symbolic gifts: a silver coin split in two, each half kept by one partner, a pair of gloves embroidered with initials, or in more rustic settings, a piece of bread broken and shared. These gestures carried the weight of contract and promise, and breaking them could be as scandalous as violating a marriage itself. Public witnesses were key. Without them, the act had no binding power. Perhaps the most bizarre staging of intimacy, however, came in the form of bed inspections. In certain high-stakes marriages, especially those involving property or political alliances, the consummation of the union was a matter of legal record. Trusted witnesses, sometimes high-ranking clergy, sometimes family elders, were tasked with verifying that the couple had indeed shared a bed. In theory, this was to protect the legitimacy of heirs. In practice, it was an exercise in awkward formalism. Curtains might be drawn back just enough to reveal the couple lying together, or the room entered the morning after, to note the state of the bedclothes. To modern ears, this may sound invasive to the point of absurdity, but in a world where land titles and alliances could hinge on questions of legitimacy, such rituals were treated with solemnity. And like so much in medieval life, they were also open to manipulation. A cooperative witness, a carefully staged scene, or an understanding household could present a convincing facade, even when reality was quite different. Outside these formal performances, there were smaller, more playful spectacles woven into everyday life. Seasonal love courts popped up at fairs where a self-appointed judge and jury presided over mock cases of romantic mischief. A young man accused of stealing glances might be sentenced to serenade the complainant. A girl guilty of heart theft could be ordered to wear a garland of flowers until sundown. These amusements, while lighthearted, reinforced a shared understanding of courtship etiquette and allowed the community to gently police its own norms. Even punishment could be theatrical. The charivari mentioned earlier in its wedding context might be resurrected to shame an adulterer or a mismatched couple. Villagers would bang pots and pans, parade effigies, and sing mocking songs outside the home of the offenders. The cacophony could last late into the night, drawing a crowd from miles around. Sometimes the targets responded with good humor, offering food and drink to the mob in exchange for a quick dispersal. Other times, tensions simmered for months afterward. All of this constant staging mock weddings, love courts bed inspections, and noisy public processions kept the business of love firmly in the public eye. Intimacy was never wholly private, and even its most personal moments were framed in some way for the audience of the community. That audience might be a handful of neighbors peering over a garden fence or the entire village gathered on the green, but it was always there, ready to watch, judge, and remember. And as you let your mind drift with this quiet, strange procession, imagine the soft thump of feet on wooden stages, the muffled rustle of costumes in candlelight, and the knowing murmurs of spectators pressed shoulder to shoulder. For in the chapters ahead, we'll find that this love as theater could extend even further into realms where intimacy was tested, displayed, and preserved in ways that blur the line between devotion, superstition, and spectacle. One such method was the gifting of subtle relics, tokens meant to carry the essence of the beloved. These could be perfectly ordinary items transformed by sentiment, a piece of fabric cut from a sleeve, a small ring or a clasp that had been worn close to the skin. But some were decidedly more personal. Whispered accounts describe lovers exchanging locks of hair braided with thread, or even tiny cloth sachets scented with the giver's own perfume or natural scent. Kept in a chest or tucked into a pouch, worn at the waist, such relics could serve as a quiet anchor for longing, especially when the giver and receiver were separated by distance. Among the nobility, the preservation of intimacy could take more elaborate forms. Portrait miniatures, small painted likenesses often enclosed in cases, were popular gifts between lovers and betrothed couples. While to us they might seem like polite tokens, the symbolism could be far more charged. A miniature might depict the giver with a certain flower in hand, or framed against a background rich with heraldic meaning, signaling loyalty, fidelity, or fertility. The image was a promise as much as a likeness, and to keep it close was to carry a constant reminder of the bond. Even humbler folk had their own ways of keeping love. In rural communities, carved wooden spoons, combs, or boxes were common gifts between courting partners. The designs could be intricate hearts, interlocking knots, stylized birds. These were not idle decorations, but visual shorthand for promises, sometimes even functioning as a sort of engagement announcement when displayed in a home. In some regions, the exchange of such items was binding enough to be cited in disputes over broken promises to marry. The preservation of intimacy could also take the form of shared rituals repeated over time. A couple might return to the same grove every spring or share a drink from the same cup on certain feast days. These acts, while private, were woven into the seasonal rhythm of life, much like planting or harvest. And in a small community, such patterns did not go unnoticed. Neighbors might gently tease, recognizing the importance of those repeated moments, even without knowing their details. Perhaps most curious were the instances where intimacy was deliberately staged to be seen and remembered. In some noble households, a couple's first shared meal after marriage was held in the great hall before a full gathering of family and allies. The bride and groom would sit together at the high table, sometimes eating from the same trencher or cup, in a display meant to symbolize unity. Musicians played, toasts were given, and onlookers noted every detail, whether they leaned toward each other, whether they laughed together, whether they looked comfortable or not. In more theatrical courts, even private reconciliations could be turned into semi-public ceremonies. A quarreling couple might be coaxed into exchanging tokens again, or clasping hands before witnesses as a sign that harmony had been restored. These moments were carefully choreographed, right down to the words spoken, ensuring that the reconciliation was as visible as the quarrel had been. Then there was the curious practice of embedding love tokens into architecture. Some castles and manor houses still bear faint carvings, initials entwined symbols made discreetly in beams, lintels, or stonework. These marks could be hidden in private chambers or boldly placed where visitors might see them, serving as permanent witnesses to affection. In some cases, they were accompanied by short inscriptions or dates, turning the walls themselves into silent chroniclers of personal history. Even the church, despite its caution around overt displays of passion, had its own ways of memorializing marital bonds. Special masses could be commissioned to bless a union, and the couple's names might be entered into the parish's Liber Vitae, a book of life ensuring they would be remembered in prayers for years to come. For wealthy patrons, this commemoration might be literal, as well-stained glass windows depicting the couple's likenesses kneeling together beneath the gaze of saints. Such art balanced piety with personal pride, a lasting image of unity sanctified by holy light. And yet, not all these preservations were born of romance. Sometimes they were acts of insurance, physical proof of a union's legitimacy or of promises made. A token could be produced in court as evidence. A carving might serve as a public declaration, difficult to deny later. In this way, the keepsakes of love were not only sentimental, but strategic tools in the long game of securing honor, property, and alliances. As we drift further into this strange weave of the personal and the public, imagine the quiet weight of a locket in the hand, the glint of initials cut into old oak, the shared smile across a high table as the hall watches. These gestures, however small, were the threads that tied private feeling to public life, ensuring that love, whether tender, strategic, or both, left its mark. And as our journey continues, we will find that the urge to record and ritualize desire could stretch even further, spilling into customs that touched every stage of life from youthful flirtation to the final parting of lovers. Youthful courtship often began in the open, almost playfully. In villages, it might take the form of Maying, when young people went into the woods at dawn on May Day to gather greenery flowers, and if one believes the whispers, something more than plant life. Officially, these excursions were about celebrating spring, decorating the village with blossoms and branches to welcome fertility for the year. Unofficially, the woods offered privacy, and the dawn light had a way of making even the most ordinary encounters feel enchanted. In towns, apprentices and maidens found subtler opportunities. A trip to the well or the market could be timed to coincide with the other's errands. A shared task, mending nets, tending animals, preparing festival garlands, allowed for conversation under the approving gaze of neighbors. These moments might seem unremarkable, but they formed the latticework on which deeper bonds grew. Even the smallest gestures, like carrying a heavy bucket for someone or offering a morsel of food, could ripple outward, becoming the stuff of local speculation. As affection deepened, courtship rituals became more intentional. In some regions, it was customary for a young man to visit the home of his intended in the evening, often bringing a small gift or playing a song beneath her window. This night, visiting tolerated under the watchful eye of the household, allowed for whispered conversation in the glow of the hearth. In colder months, the practice of bundling might reappear here, two young people sharing a bed fully clothed, with the understanding or the hope that propriety would be observed. Of course, the reality could be rather more complicated. Once marriage was on the horizon, the pace of ritual quickened. Gifts became more formal and public declarations were made. Betrothal feasts, though not always as grand as the wedding itself, were important markers. They signaled to the community that the couple was bound in a promise not easily broken. In some places, breaking a betrothal without cause could result in legal action, fines, or social disgrace. The exchange of symbolic items, rings, gloves, even a shared loaf of bread, carried legal as well as emotional weight. Marriage itself, as we have seen, was both a private bond and a public event. But what happened after the wedding could be just as steeped in tradition. The early months of marriage were often subject to close observation, especially if an heir was expected. A lack of pregnancy might prompt neighbors to offer unsolicited advice, gifts of fertility foods, or even suggestions for charms and blessings. While these interventions could be kindly meant, they were also a reminder that in a small community, the most personal matters were everyone's business. And then inevitably came the end of the story. Death did not erase the rituals of intimacy, it transformed them. In many places, widows and widowers wore specific garments or badges of mourning for a set period, signaling their loss to the world. The length of mourning could vary. A year and a day was common, but for the wealthy or high-born, longer periods might be expected. During this time, remarriage was discouraged or forbidden outright. For those who defied the rule, scandal often followed, especially if the new match was seen as too hasty. There were also intimate customs for mourning itself. Some widows kept a token of the deceased close at hand, a lock of hair, a piece of jewelry, a favorite cup or tool. In certain traditions, these tokens were placed beneath the mourner's pillow, as though to keep the departed near in dreams. Others went further still. In parts of Europe, the deceased's bed might be dismantled, its wood burned or repurposed to prevent the spirit from lingering. Yet, in other regions, the bed was left untouched for a time, the room kept as it had been in a silent vigil. Among the nobility, memorialization could be monumental. Tomb effigies often depicted husband and wife side by side, their hands joined in eternal prayer. In some cases, these effigies were commissioned during the couple's lifetime, serving as both a statement of unity and a promise of perpetual remembrance. Churches might display stained glass bearing the couple's likenesses or heraldry, ensuring that future generations would see and recall their bond. Even in death, superstition lingered. It was sometimes believed that a spouse who died without having received certain blessings might appear in dreams to request them. Stories abound of widows or widowers making pilgrimages, commissioning masses, or performing symbolic acts, such as pouring water over the threshold or turning the marital bed to face a new direction to release the departed. These gestures blurred the line between mourning and magical thinking, between farewell and continued conversation. In the quiet of the medieval night, love and loss were never wholly separate. The rituals that marked them were not just about closure. They were about keeping the thread intact, even if only in memory. And as we move toward the final stretches of this journey, the strange tapestry of medieval intimacy will draw tighter still its threads of romance, superstition, duty, and display, woven into patterns that could only have existed in that curious candle-lit world. Consider the strange role of time itself. It was not enough to fall in love or to marry. One had to do so at the right moment. Lovers and newlyweds alike might consult the liturgical calendar, the cycles of the moon, or even the advice of a local astrologer before making decisions. Some days were considered so unlucky for love that no one of sense would wed upon them. Fridays, for example, were avoided in many places, both because of their association with Christ's passion and because they were ruled by Venus, whose influence could be changeable and capricious. Wednesdays, in contrast, were favored for weddings in parts of England thought to bring balance and prosperity. More elaborate still were the belief-laden threshold rituals. In countless regions, it was customary for a groom to carry his bride across the threshold of their home. Today, this is a quaint symbol. In the medieval mind, it was a vital protection against malevolent forces thought to lurk at doorways. The act broke any ill luck that might trip the bride as she entered her new life. In some places, additional measures were taken, sprinkling salt at the lintel, sweeping the doorstep with a broom blessed at Candlemas, or hanging a sprig of rowan or rosemary to ward off spirits jealous of the couple's joy. Inside the home, the arrangement of the marriage bed was another arena for ritual care. In parts of Central Europe, the bed might be turned to face east toward the rising sun to encourage fertility and harmony. In other regions, the bed frame was struck 3 times with a branch of hazel or birch, both woods associated with luck and vitality. Even the choice of bed linens could be symbolic: red for passion, green for fertility, white for purity. These details were not decorative flourishes. They were understood as protective spells woven into the very fabric of the couple's life. Courtship, too, could be governed by time and season. Spring and early summer were prime periods for formal betrothals, their alignment with planting and growth offering an obvious symbolism. In some villages, the day after the first sowing was set aside for a communal dance in which unmarried men and women paired off, sometimes leading directly to engagements. The belief was simple: as the fields flourished, so too would new unions. Autumn, by contrast, was seen as a time for quieting passions, a season of preparation rather than beginnings. Alongside these calendrical customs were the smaller, more intimate signs that a relationship was taking root. In many parts of Europe, sharing food carried particular weight. A young man offering a bite from his own trencher, or a woman pouring wine for a man, not of her family, could be seen as the first step toward a formal attachment. This symbolism could be heightened during festivals when special foods, cakes shaped like hearts, honeyed fruits, sugared nuts were exchanged between prospective partners. Then there were the testing games, informal trials of compatibility woven into local traditions. These might involve working together on a small task, kneading dough, carrying water, or weaving a garland under the watchful eyes of elders who claimed they could tell from posture and patience alone whether the match would prosper. In more playful forms, the tests were framed as wagers. Could the man catch the woman in a gentle chase across the village green, or could she balance a filled jug while walking the length of the hall? The laughter such games produced was genuine, but their judgments were often taken surprisingly seriously. At the fringes of these customs lay the talismans and charms that quietly reinforced them. Some were meant to draw love, a small cloth pouch of dried rose petals and thyme worn at the breast, a strip of parchment with a psalm verse written in red ink, a silver coin rubbed on a lover's cheek, and then kept in a pocket. Others were defensive, meant to keep unwanted admirers at bay, sprigs of nettle tucked into a sash or a pin concealed in clothing. These protective measures were the silent companions to public ritual unseen but deeply believed in. What is perhaps most striking is how seamlessly these gestures blended the sacred, the superstitious, and the everyday. The same broom that swept the floor might be used to bless a doorway. The same bread that fed a household could serve as a marriage pledge. In the medieval mind, there was no rigid separation between the mystical and the mundane. Love's luck was part of life's luck, and both were thought to depend on the careful tending of unseen threads. And as you drift further into this candlelit maze of gestures and omens, imagine the creak of a wooden bed frame turned toward the dawn, the faint crunch of salt beneath a bride's slippers, the warm scent of bread shared between two people who have yet to speak the word forever, but are already living it. From here, our path leads toward the final curiosities of this world, customs so particular, so richly woven with belief and performance, that they seem to belong entirely to their own strange realm. One such custom was the love oath at the crossroads. In certain rural districts, couples would meet at a place where two or more paths crossed often at dusk or dawn and pledge their faith to one another. The choice of location was no accident. Crossroads were thought to be liminal spaces where earthly and otherworldly forces met. To bind a promise, there was to give it extra potency. In some tellings, the couple would link hands over a running stream at the crossing, letting water carry their joined reflection away, a sign that their fates were now mingled. In others, they pressed a coin into the earth, paying the spirits of the place to witness and protect the union. In the more theatrical courts, an equivalent took the form of secret vows in the garden. Lovers, sometimes legitimate, sometimes less so, would meet in carefully tended pleasure grounds at twilight. Surrounded by carved fountains, trellised roses, and the murmur of leaves, they might exchange whispered promises or tokens hidden in the folds of cloaks. Court poets immortalized such scenes in verse, often disguising the real identities behind allegorical names. The imagery was deliberate. Gardens were symbols of both cultivated beauty and hidden pleasure, their walls as much about secrecy as about shelter. Then there were the feasts of reversal, small but curious traditions held in certain guilds and village fraternities. On these occasions, couples might swap clothing for the night, husbands donning their wives' dresses, wives wearing their husbands' tunics or hose, and sit in reversed positions at the table. Ostensibly a light-hearted jest, the reversal carried deeper meanings, a playful acknowledgement of the balance and imbalance of power in marriage, and perhaps a subtle reminder that roles, however fixed they seemed, could shift under the right conditions. These evenings could be raucous affairs filled with teasing and songs whose lyrics tread a careful line between humor and impropriety. In some places, the peculiar urge to blend intimacy with performance produced witnessed farewells. When one partner departed for a long journey, whether to war, pilgrimage, or trade, it was not unusual for friends and family to gather for a final meal. The couple might share a cup of spiced wine before the company, each drinking in turn as a sign of fidelity. Sometimes this gesture was followed by a dance or a brief procession to the edge of the village where the travelers were blessed. What may sound like a sweet send-off also served as a public declaration. The absent partner had the community's eye on them, and so did the one left behind. Other customs veered into the almost ceremonial policing of love. In certain towns, especially where guilds wielded strong influence, marriage or betrothal, without the blessing of the guild's elders, could be met with ritualized mockery. Newlyweds might be fined in ale or bread required to host a small feast for the guild members. The rule was rarely enforced harshly, but the message was clear: even love must pass through the gatekeepers of communal order. Perhaps the most quietly fascinating were the symbolic games played in the margins of festivals. During certain celebrations, unmarried women would weave garlands and place them in a communal basket. Young men would draw one at random, wearing the chosen garland on their hat or belt for the rest of the day. While it might appear to be a simple lottery, many a sly arrangement ensured that the right garland found the right hands. Later in dances or evening gatherings, the garland pairing might blossom into more serious conversation, and if fate and mutual interest allowed a courtship. Even the act of parting could carry ritual weight. Some couples, when forced apart, would exchange safekeeping objects: a ring, a handkerchief, or a small pouch of herbs. The giver charged the object with the responsibility of holding their affection until they returned. It was not uncommon for such tokens to be kissed before bed, or even worn at night, as though they could bridge the physical absence. The common thread in all these customs, whether playful, solemn, or faintly strange, was the conviction that love to endure must be enacted as well as felt. Words alone were never enough. Promises needed witnesses, tokens needed hands to hold them, and the invisible cord between two people needed to be tied and retied through repeated gestures. In this, the medieval world was unyielding. Intimacy was not a private possession, but a living thing tended in public ritual, guarded by communal memory, and nourished by traditions that might look peculiar to us, but felt entirely natural to them. As you sink deeper into this quiet procession of gestures, picture the cool stones of a crossroads underfoot, the rustle of borrowed clothing at a feast of reversal, the faint perfume of a garland crushed against a tunic. Soon our path will lead us to the last chambers of this journey, where the strangest customs of all reside, the ones that hover between the sacred, the forbidden, and the utterly human. Among these was the curious practice of symbolic bedding without contact. In certain rare cases, often involving politically sensitive marriages or unions between very young spouses, the couple would be ceremonially placed in bed together, while fully clothed, sometimes in front of high-ranking witnesses. The bedding might include blessings, the placing of hands upon the couple by elders, and even the tucking of covers around them. Yet no physical intimacy was expected that night. The aim was to seal the union ritually, leaving its physical consummation for a later, more suitable time. Such events could be awkwardly solemn, the gathered company pretending not to notice the stilted glances and nervous laughter. Then there were the marriages by proxy, which pushed the separation of ritual and reality even further. A stand-in, often a trusted nobleman or kinsman, would play the role of the absent bride or groom, going through the entire ceremony on their behalf. In extreme cases, even the bedding could be mimed with a proxy lying beside the spouse. Though strange to modern sensibilities, such arrangements allowed important alliances to be formed, despite distance illness or political unrest. The real couple might not meet until months or even years later, but in the eyes of law and church, they were already wed. Other customs were less about solemnity and more about testing the new bond. In some rural communities, the morning after a wedding was marked by the linen inspection. Midwives or female relatives examined the bed sheets for signs that the marriage had been consummated, interpreting their findings as proof of the couple's physical compatibility and, by extension, the wife's virtue. While such inspections could be deeply invasive, they were treated with the same ritual seriousness as other wedding customs, feeding into the broader communal concern with legitimacy and inheritance. There were also rites that edged toward the performative absurd. In certain German-speaking regions, it was customary for friends of the groom to barricade the bridal chamber with ropes or furniture, demanding a toll of food, drink, or coin before allowing the couple entry. This mock obstacle course could go on for hours, much to the amusement of the onlookers and the growing exasperation of the newlyweds. The symbolism obstacles to be overcome before the marriage could truly begin was obvious, but so was the element of pure mischief. Perhaps most intriguingly, some customs intertwined love with the supernatural in ways that were neither entirely blessing nor entirely curse. In parts of the British Isles, a couple might be led in a midnight procession around their home, carrying a lit candle between them. If the flame lasted the circuit without going out, it was taken as a sign of lasting fortune. Should it flicker or die, whispers of doom might follow them for years. Similar omens were read into the behavior of animals present at the wedding feast. A cat wandering under the table, a dog barking during the vows, a bird flying in through an open window. In each case, the occurrence would be woven into the couple's story as an omen of what lay ahead. Even the end of love could be ritualized. In a few rare but striking cases, couples who mutually wished to part ways enacted a ceremonial divorce before witnesses. Standing back to back, they would walk away from each other in opposite directions, sometimes stepping over a symbolic boundary, such as a stream, a threshold, or a line marked in the dirt. Each was then declared free to remarry. While these separations were rarely sanctioned by the church, they carried social weight in communities where practicality sometimes outweighed canon law. Threaded through all these peculiarities is the same underlying truth for the medieval mind. Love and marriage were never private matters alone. They belonged to the fabric of the community, woven with threads of tradition, belief, and spectacle. Every stage from first glance to final parting was framed, marked, and remembered. Even the strangest customs were not arbitrary. They were ways of making love visible, tangible, and accountable to forces both human and divine. And so as we leave the bustling wedding feasts, the midnight processions, the awkward proxy vows, and barricaded bedchambers, the sense lingers that intimacy in the medieval world was never just a matter of two people. It was a drama played out on the stage of life with every neighbor, priest, poet, and gossip as part of the cast. Now the last embers in our imagined hall glow low. The voices fade, the drums of the charivari fall silent, and the garlands wilt in the cool night air. But the strange rituals of love in the Middle Ages, by turns solemn, mischievous, and tender, remain like faint footprints in the dust, waiting for another telling. The faces we met tonight, peasants and nobles, lovers and onlookers, priests and poets, have stepped back into the pages of history. Their strange rituals, their whispered vows at crossroads, their garlands and charms and candlelit omens belong to a world both distant and impossibly near. For though the Middle Ages are long gone, the human heart has changed far less than the trappings around it. Desire, hope, pride, and the longing to be remembered, they still live in us as surely as they did in those candlelit rooms. And so we let the stories settle like fine dust, drifting down through a beam of moonlight. You can picture the garlands fading, the candles guttering out the heavy wooden doors, closing against the cool air. The music and laughter of feasts dissolve into the hush of sleeping streets. Somewhere in the stillness, a far-off church bell marks the hour. Breathe slowly now. Let the murmur of these old tales fall back into silence, the details softening at the edges, their colors dimming like painted glass in twilight. You are safe here, far from the cold stone floors and the watchful eyes of medieval neighbors. The weight of the blankets is your fortress. The rhythm of your breath is your own quiet ritual. Let go, rest, drift, The journey is complete.